Okay, virtue ethics. Now, virtue ethics, the fundamental principles of this normative ethical theory are founded on Aristotle's ethical moral philosophy. So let us get to know first Aristotle. So he was born in the city of Stagira. In ancient times, Stagira was part of Macedonia, which is another kingdom north of Greece. So Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher and influential intellectual figure in Western history. Okay, so Aristotle is very important in the history of Western civilization, especially when you talk about learning and science. Aristotle's works are indispensable. So he wrote extensively on different subject matters like logic, physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, which is a fundamental branch of philosophy, psychology, ethics, politics, poetry, and many others. He was actually a student of Plato in the academy in ancient Athens. So the Greek philosopher Plato established a school called the Academy in Athens in Greece. And at a young age, Aristotle was enrolled in Plato's academy. Later, Aristotle established his own school called the Lyceum. And at some point of his life, he also became the tutor of Alexander the Great. Okay? At a young age, the Prince Alexander, son of King Philip of Macedon, he was taught by Aristotle himself. So Alexander learned from one of the best intellectual figures in Western civilization. So this is one of Aristotle's fundamental work on ethics. Okay, the title of the book is Nicomachean Ethics. And this is where we find the fundamental principles of his ethical theory, which is known as virtue ethics. So Aristotle opens the Nicomachean Ethics with these words, and I quote, "Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action as well as choice, is held to aim at some good. Hence people have nobly declared that the good is that at which all things aim." End of quote. So Aristotle believes that everything that we humans do, all our actions, even all our inquiry, every artistic endeavor or undertaking, we do all these things in view of some good. And in fact, it is the general claim of people that the good is that which all things aim. We don't, for example, do things because we consider them as bad. We always do things primarily because we see them as good, or rather we see the end point as good. For instance, why do you study? Okay, why do you attend our online lectures? Because you want to learn something. Okay, and learning something is something that you consider good. Or if simply your reason for studying is just to pass the subject, then even passing the subject is something that you consider good. So all things that we do are always directed towards some good, meaning to say there is a purposive aspect of our actions. Our actions have a purpose. Okay, Aristotle says that knowledge of this good is greatly important in view of our life. The search for the good is the business of political art. Okay. This is ultimately the goal of every human being. Okay, to achieve something good, and that knowing this good is important in our lives. This is the end goal of political art or political science. Okay? Politics is essentially linked to ethics, according to Aristotle. So we always do things in view of the good. That is the ultimate goal we want in life. Aristotle asks the question, what is the highest of all goods? Okay, what is the ultimate good which we humans consider? So I quote, "As for its name, then it is pretty much agreed on by most people, for both the many and the few that it is happiness. And they suppose that living well and acting well are the same thing as being happy." End of quote. So for Aristotle, we humans have different conceptions of the good. Some of you may consider learning, education as good. Some of us also consider money as good. Some of us consider having good relations with people as good, etc. But all these good things ultimately are subsumed under one thing that we consider good, and it is the highest good. Okay, and this highest good is called happiness. And for the Greek mind, with the ancient Greeks, they suppose that living well, okay, or living the good life and doing well, acting well, they are the same thing as being happy. So the good life is the life of happiness. In other words, it's the same thing. And that's why, if you remember, in our introduction to ethics, the search for the meaning of these things, the good life or happiness, this is the first impetus for the study of ethics. So in Greek, we have a very rich term which could loosely mean happiness. This term is called eudaimonia. This is the Greek word for either the good life, happiness, and it is also translated as human flourishing. Eudaimonia. So eudaimonia is the ultimate goal of human existence. All humans want to attain that. Question: what do we need to possess so as to live well and do well? Now Aristotle gives us provides an answer to this, and he says that it is virtue. Virtue is the main for us to live and do well. This is something that is necessary in order to attain that, and if we want to attain eudaimonia, then we must possess this thing. It is a virtue. Okay, now the virtue of a human being would be that characteristic as a result of which a human being becomes good, and as a result of which he causes his own work to be done well, quote unquote. Aristotle argues that it is virtue that fulfills the nature of a human being, because it is virtue that makes a human being good, and as a result of which virtue allows a human being to make his work to be done well. Okay, so it is virtue which makes a human being good, and it drives the human being to do something well. In other words, virtue makes a human being excellent. That's why in Greek, the Greek word for virtue, which is arete, is also translated as excellence. Virtue makes us excellent. Now, what specifically is virtue? Okay. What is the definition of virtue, in other words? What is the essence of virtue? So Aristotle provides this definition in the Nicomachean Ethics. Virtue is a characteristic marked by choice, residing in the mean relative to us, a characteristic defined by reason and as person would define it. Virtue is also a mean with respect to two vices, the one vice related to excess, the other to deficiency. And further, it is a mean because some vices fall short of and others exceed what should be the case in both passions and actions, whereas virtue discovers and chooses the middle term. Thus, with respect to its being and the definition that states what it is, virtue is a mean, but with respect to what is best and the doing of something well, it is an extreme. Quote unquote.
So Aristotle defines virtue as follows, and I quote, "Virtue, therefore, is a characteristic marked by choice, residing in the mean relative to us, a characteristic defined by reason and as a person would define it. Virtue is also a mean with respect to two vices, the one vice related to excess, the other to deficiency. And further, it is a mean because some vices fall short of and others exceed what should be the case in both passions and actions, whereas virtue discovers and chooses the middle term. Thus, with respect to its being and the definition that states what it is, virtue is a mean, but with respect to what is best and the doing of something well, it is an extreme." End of quote. So generally speaking, virtue is a characteristic. Now, a characteristic, according to Aristotle, is something present in the soul of man. And as something which is present in the soul of man, characteristic is that in reference to some passions and actions, a human being is in a good state or a bad state. So this characteristic is manifested whenever man makes a choice, and it resides in himself. It is defined and determined by his reason. Specifically, virtue is a mean. Another word for mean is middle term, or a middle point. Now, this entails that virtue stands in between two vices, and these two vices are related to virtue either as a deficiency or an excess. Rather, one of these vices is a deficiency or a lack of virtue, and the other one is an excess of virtue. Now, whatever falls short of and exceeds what should be the case or what should be enough in both passions and actions is bad. Virtue discovers and chooses the middle term. So the man who is able to choose this mean is the man who is able to do something good. This is the basis of good action in Aristotle's virtue ethics. And this is called his doctrine of the mean. And here is an illustration to help you understand further. So virtue stands in the middle. It is a mean in between two extremes. These extremes are vices, and one of these vices is an excess. The other one is a deficiency. Take, for example, courage. Now, usually we would define courage as putting yourself in harm's way for the sake of others. But actually, there are cases when you do not need to put yourself in harm's way for the sake of others. Being courageous does not always mean doing that. Rather, being courageous also means knowing when not to put yourself in harm's way for the sake of others. It wouldn't be a courageous thing to do to intervene right away in a dangerous situation if you know that you would fall victim also in that situation. So in those cases, it would be a courageous thing, in fact, to call others for help. Now, when you intervene right away without trying to assess the situation, then you have too much courage in you, and that is an excess of courage. That is recklessness. On the other end, if you know that you can handle the situation by helping someone who is in need from a certain threat, but then you did not act, then you lack courage in yourself. And that is also a bad thing, and that is cowardice, the deficiency of courage. Now, Aristotle says that all virtues work the same way.
Now, Aristotle distinguishes among different kinds of virtues. There are two types of virtues. First, intellectual virtues. Second, there are moral virtues. Intellectual virtues, they are learned through education. Okay. For example, wisdom, comprehension, and prudence. Okay. Intellectual virtues can be taught, okay, through education. There are, however, moral virtues which are not learned through education but through habit. That means by constantly doing them over and over again, by repeatedly doing them. For example, virtues of liberality, moderation, and courage are moral virtues. And in fact, in the book, The Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle presents a table. Okay, he has a table which presents virtues and their corresponding extremes, and extremes or their corresponding excess and deficiencies. Okay, we have discussed courage, okay, as an example. So what does this now, in Aristotle's virtue ethics, therefore, the right actions will flow naturally from a man who possesses virtue. If you do the same good thing repeatedly, over and over again, then it becomes part of your character. So that the next time you're about to do something, okay, the right actions or the good actions flow naturally from yourself, because you have already nurtured it in yourself. Okay, you have incorporated it in yourself already. Now, as a normative ethical theory, virtue ethics focuses more on cultivation of virtues and character formation than rule following. So we said normative ethics mainly presents us with moral principles, rules, or standards that direct good behavior or good action. But virtue ethics, although a normative ethical theory, does not directly focus on following rules. Rather, it focuses more on how one should cultivate virtues, good characteristics, how one should form his character. Because again, if these things are done first, cultivating virtues, forming character, then eventually the good actions will flow naturally from that person. Okay? That is virtue ethics.